I'm Lydia, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down. But let's start from the beginning. I grew up in a wealthy family, the only child of doting parents who gave me everything I could ever want. My father, Robert, was a successful businessman, and my mother, Eleanor, was a socialite who threw the best parties in town. They showered me with love and attention, making sure I never lacked anything. When I entered college, I was determined to make my parents proud. I buried myself in books, focusing solely on my studies. That's when Tom entered my life. Tom was persistent, I'll give him that. He'd wait for me after classes, bring me coffee during late-night study sessions, and even showed up at my parents' house one day. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, standing tall in our living room, "I'm in love with your daughter, and I want you to know my intentions are serious." My father was impressed. He'd always wanted a son, someone to take under his wing and groom for the business world. Tom seemed to fit the bill perfectly. "Lydia," my father said to me later that evening, "why don't you give this young man a chance? He seems like a good catch." Reluctantly, I agreed to go on a date with Tom. To my surprise, I found myself enjoying his company. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. Our relationship blossomed quickly. Before I knew it, we were walking down the aisle, fresh out of college. My parents were overjoyed, especially my father, who saw Tom as the son he never had. "Welcome to the family, son," my father said, clapping Tom on the back at our wedding reception. "I have big plans for us." True to his word, my father helped Tom start his own business, a state-of-the-art car wash. He bought all the necessary equipment and even helped us purchase a small, cozy house. A year into our marriage, I gave birth to our son, Michael. Holding him in my arms for the first time, I felt a love I had never experienced before. I threw myself into motherhood, becoming a full-time housewife. My days were filled with diaper changes, feeding schedules, and lullabies. As the years rolled by, our lives settled into a routine. Michael grew from a gurgling baby into a curious toddler, then a mischievous child, and finally a brooding teenager. I poured my heart and soul into raising him, while Tom continued to struggle with the car wash business. "Your father thinks I'm a failure," Tom spat one evening after another tense phone call. "He's always looking down on me, giving me handouts like I'm some charity case." I tried to reassure him. "That's not true, Tom. Dad's just trying to help." These arguments became more frequent, and I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home. Michael, now in his late teens, began to withdraw, spending more time in his room or out with friends. As for me, well, the years of stress and housework had taken their toll. I was no longer the slim college girl Tom had wooed. My once toned body had softened, and I'd gained weight. Tom didn't hesitate to point this out. "You've really let yourself go, Lydia," he'd say, eyeing me with disappointment. "What happened to that pretty girl I married?" His words stung, but I tried to brush them off. I told myself he was just stressed about work, that he didn't really mean it. But deep down, I knew our marriage was crumbling. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a sunny Tuesday when I received the call that would shatter my world. "Mrs. Thompson," a somber voice said. "I'm afraid there's been an accident. Your parents, they were in a small plane crash in Hawaii." "I'm so sorry, but they didn't survive." The next few weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and paperwork. Tom was surprisingly absent during this time, leaving me to handle everything on my own. When he was around, he seemed almost cheerful. "We need to sort out the inheritance," he said, barely a week after the funeral. "Have you spoken to the lawyer yet?" I was shocked by his insensitivity. "Tom, I'm still grieving. Can't this wait?" He shrugged. "Business doesn't wait, Lydia. We need to know where we stand financially." Reluctantly, I agreed to meet with the family lawyer, Mr. Jacobson. As we sat in his plush office, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Thompson, your parents' will is unusual. It's divided into two parts. I can only reveal the first part now. The second part will be disclosed in exactly 1 year. Tom leaned forward, his eyes glinting. Well, what does the first part say? Mr. Jacobson adjusted his glasses. Your parents have left their mansion to your future grandchildren, with their guardians as trustees until they come of age. I was stunned. But Michael is our only child, and he's not even married yet. As if on cue, Michael, who had insisted on coming to the meeting, let out a low whistle. Wow, that opens up some interesting possibilities, doesn't it? I turned to look at my son, confused by his reaction, but he avoided my gaze. Tom, on the other hand, was fuming. That's it? He demanded. What about the rest of their assets? The businesses? The money? Mr. Jacobson shook his head. I'm afraid that information is in the second part of the will, which cannot be revealed for another year. As we left the lawyer's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Tom was uncharacteristically quiet, while Michael seemed lost in thought. Just a few weeks after the reading of the will, Michael dropped a bombshell that left me reeling. Mom, Dad, he announced one evening at dinner, I have someone I want you to meet. The next day, he brought home a young woman named Sarah. She was pretty, with long blonde hair and a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. This is my wife, Michael said, his arm around her waist. And she's pregnant with our child. I nearly choked on my tea. Wife? Pregnant? But when did all this happen? Michael shrugged, avoiding my gaze. We'd been dating for a while. When we found out about the baby, we decided to get married right away. I couldn't help but notice how his eyes flickered to Tom, who was nodding approvingly. Something about this whole situation felt off, but I pushed my doubts aside. After all, I was going to be a grandmother. Well, congratulations, I said, trying to muster up some enthusiasm. This is quite a surprise. Sarah's smile widened. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm so excited to be part of your family. From that day on, our household dynamics shifted dramatically. Sarah moved in, citing the need to be close to family during her pregnancy. At first, I was thrilled to have a female companion in the house. However, it quickly became apparent that Sarah had her own agenda. She began to subtly undermine me at every turn. When I'd cook dinner, she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "Oh, is that how you make it?" I always thought it was done differently. But it was her interactions with Tom that really set off alarm bells. She'd laugh at his jokes, touch his arm, and shower him with compliments. You're such a talented businessman, Tom, she'd coo. I don't know how you manage it all. Tom, predictably, lapped up the attention. He began spending more time at home, but not with me. He'd sit for hours, talking business with Sarah while I was relegated to the background. I tried to talk to Michael about Sarah's behavior, but he brushed off my concerns. Mom, you're just being paranoid, he'd say. Sarah's great. Maybe you're just jealous, because you're not the center of attention anymore. His words hurt more than he could know. Had I raised a son who cared so little for his mother's feelings? As for Tom, he seemed to revel in the new family dynamic. He'd beam with pride when Sarah complimented him, and I'd catch him looking at me with something akin to disgust. One day, while out grocery shopping, I ran into an old college friend, Jessica. We decided to catch up over coffee, and as we reminisced about our college days, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Remember that guy who was always chasing rich girls? Jessica asked. What was his name? Tom something? My heart skipped a beat. Tom? Tom who? Jessica laughed. Oh, you know, that sleazy guy who tried to date every girl with wealthy parents. He ended up marrying some naive rich girl, if I remember correctly. As Jessica continued talking, describing Tom's behavior in college, I felt like I was going to be sick. The Tom she was describing sounded exactly like my husband. Had our entire marriage been based on a lie? With a heavy heart and shaking hands, I pulled into our driveway. The house loomed before me, no longer the cozy home I once loved, but a stage for the drama that was about to unfold. I found Tom in his study, poring over some papers. He barely looked up when I entered. "Tom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk." He sighed, finally meeting my eyes. "What is it now, Lydia?" I took a deep breath. "I ran into Jessica today. You remember her from college, right?" A flicker of something, was it fear? Passed across his face before he schooled his features into indifference. Vaguely. "What about her?" "She told me about a guy in college. A guy who pursued rich girls, looking for an easy meal ticket." I paused, watching his reaction. "Sound familiar, Tom?" For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, to my shock, he started laughing. Well, he chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Took you long enough to figure it out, didn't it?" His cavalier attitude stunned me. "So it's true? You married me for my parents' money?" Tom shrugged, not a hint of remorse in his eyes. "Of course I did. Look, Lydia. I never loved you. I tolerated you because you were my meal ticket. But now? Now you're just a fat, useless burden." His words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, tears welling in my eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "Because, my dear wife, I don't need you anymore. Your parents are dead, and soon, their fortune will be mine. Or rather, our grandson's, which amounts to the same thing." Suddenly, everything clicked into place: Michael's hasty marriage, Sarah's convenient pregnancy, the way they'd been treating me. It had all been a calculated move to secure my parents' inheritance. You planned all this?" I gasped. Tom laughed again, the sound grating on my nerves. "Give credit where it's due. It was mostly Michael's idea. The boy's got a good head for business, unlike his mother." I felt like I was drowning, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. "Does Sarah know about this?" "Of course she does," Tom sneered. "She's a smart girl, knows a good opportunity when she sees one. Unlike you, she'll make a proper wife for a businessman." I couldn't take any more. I turned and fled from the room, my world shattered around me. As the reality of my situation sank in, I realized I had nowhere to go. I had no money of my own, not even enough to rent an apartment. With a heavy heart, I resigned myself to staying in the house with people I could no longer trust. 2 months later, Tom dropped another bombshell on me. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he strode in with a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Pack your bags, Lydia," he announced without preamble. "We're moving into your parents' house." I nearly dropped the knife I was holding. "What? When did we decide this?" Tom's laugh was cold and mocking. "We didn't decide anything. I decided. We're moving in with Michael and Sarah. After all, our grandson is the heir to that house." Each word was like a slap to my face. "What do you mean? What about our house?" "Oh, that?" Tom waved dismissively. "I sold it. The money's already been spent on things for people I actually care about. And just so we're clear, you're not on that list." Over the next few days, I watched in stunned silence as Tom, Michael, and Sarah excitedly prepared for the move. They bought new cars, splurged on expensive clothes and gadgets, all while I faded into the background, ignored and forgotten. The move to my parents' house was like a twisted parody of a happy family relocation. Sarah immediately claimed the master bedroom, while I was relegated to a small guest room in the back of the house. As the days passed, I found myself increasingly isolated. Sarah gave birth to my grandson and began delegating all the housework to me. I cooked, cleaned, and even cared for my grandson while she lounged about, issuing orders like a queen. "Lydia," she'd call out. "The baby needs changing. And while you're at it, could you tidy up the living room? It's looking a bit messy." I threw myself into caring for my grandson, finding solace in his innocent smiles and gurgles. But even that joy was tainted by the constant barbs and criticism from Sarah and Tom. One evening, about a month after we'd moved in, things came to a head. We were all seated at the dinner table, a dinner I had prepared, as usual. Sarah was in rare form, ordering me about as if I were a servant. "Lydia, fetch me some more water. And hurry up with clearing these plates. We don't have all night." Something in me snapped. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt came pouring out. "Enough," I shouted, slamming my hands on the table. "I am not your maid, Sarah. This is my parents' house, and I deserve some respect." The room fell silent. Sarah's face crumpled, and she burst into dramatic tears. "How could you speak to me like that? After all we've done for you?" Tom stood up, his face red with anger. "That's it, Lydia. I've had enough of your ingratitude. Pack your things and get out. This house belongs to our grandson now, and you're no longer welcome here." I stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you these. Divorce papers, already signed. I want you gone by morning." I looked to Michael, hoping against hope that my son would defend me. But he just shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm an adult now, Mom. I don't need you anymore." With shaking hands, I took the divorce papers. Sarah's triumphant smirk was the last thing I saw as I turned and walked out of the dining room, my world crumbling around me. With nowhere to go and my world in shambles, I found myself dialing a familiar number. Jessica, my old college friend, answered on the second ring. "Lydia, is everything okay?" Her voice was laced with concern. I swallowed hard. "Not really. I need a place to stay." Without hesitation, Jessica invited me to her home. As I settled into her guest room, she shared her own family drama. "My son's been going through hell," she confided. "His fiancée left him, and she's pregnant. He's desperate to find her and be there for his child." My heart skipped a beat. "Do you have a picture of her?" Jessica nodded, pulling out her phone. As she showed me the photo, my blood ran cold. Staring back at me was Sarah, my supposed daughter-in-law. "Jessica," I said slowly, "I think I know where your son's fiancée is." Over cups of tea, I poured out my story. Jessica listened, her expression morphing from shock to anger to determination. "We need to expose them," she declared. "All of them." Together, we hatched a plan. The next day, I returned to my parents' house under the guise of collecting the last of my belongings. While there, I managed to snag a few strands of my grandson's hair for a DNA test. The wait for the results was agonizing, but when they finally came, they confirmed our suspicions. My son was not the father of Sarah's baby. Jessica's son was. As I grappled with how to break this news to Michael and Tom, my phone rang. It was Mr. Jacobson, my parents' lawyer. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "it's time to review the second part of your parents' will. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" The next day, I sat in Mr. Jacobson's plush office, my heart pounding. As he read the will, I could hardly believe my ears. "To our beloved daughter, Lydia," he read, "we leave our luxury apartment, valued at $500,000. But that wasn't all. My parents had foreseen everything. In the event of a divorce, all their property, including Tom's business, would come to me. Your father wants you to know," Mr. Jacobson continued, "that he's been the one financing Tom's business all along. He registered it in his own name. In case of divorce, it's yours to do with as you please." I sat there, stunned. All this time, I thought I had nothing, when in reality, I had everything. "What about the house Tom and I lived in?" I asked, remembering he had sold it. Mr. Jacobson smiled. "That's the only thing Tom can claim. Everything else is yours." As the reality of my new situation sank in, I couldn't help but laugh. Tom had thought he was so clever, but in the end, he had outsmarted himself. I stepped into my new apartment and gasped. The space was breathtaking, all sleek lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, and tasteful, expensive furnishings. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home. As I was exploring my new sanctuary, my phone rang. It was Michael. "Mom," he said without preamble, "it's been a year since the first part of the will was read. We need to know what's in the second part." His tone was demanding, entitled. "I'm sure Grandpa and Grandma left everything to me, right?" I couldn't help but chuckle inwardly at his presumption. "Michael, this isn't a conversation we should have over the phone. Why don't you, Sarah, and your father come over tomorrow morning? I'll text you the address." After hanging up, I called Jessica. "It's time," I told her. "Can you come over tomorrow morning? We're going to settle this once and for all." The next day, I heard the doorbell ring. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find Tom, Michael, Sarah, and the baby standing there. Their jaws dropped as they took in the luxurious surroundings. Michael whistled. "Wow, Mom. This place is amazing. I can't wait to move in." Sarah's eyes gleamed with greed. "Yes, it'll be so nice once we get rid of all this old lady decor. And of course, once we get rid of you, Lydia." I raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't be so hasty if I were you. Please, come in and have a seat." As they settled onto the plush sofa, I excused myself for a moment. When I returned, I wasn't alone. Jessica stood beside me, her presence causing Sarah to pale visibly. "Before we discuss the will," I said, my voice steady, "there's someone I'd like you all to meet. This is my friend, Jessica." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. Michael and Tom just looked confused. "Now," I continued, "I think it's time we all had a frank discussion. There are some truths that need to be revealed." I paused, savoring the moment. All night, I had rehearsed what I was about to say. The words I had practiced, the revelations I was about to make, would change everything. As I looked at the faces of those who had betrayed me, my ex-husband, my son, and the woman who had tried to steal my life, I felt a surge of righteous anger mixed with anticipation. As Jessica got closer, Tom's eyes widened with recognition. A smirk spread across his face as he let out a bitter laugh. Well, he sneered, gesturing towards me. "Looks like I achieved my goal after all. Married a rich fool, didn't I?" His words stung, but I held my ground. "We'll address your betrayal later, Tom. Right now, there's something more pressing to discuss." I turned to Sarah, who was visibly squirming. "We know the truth about you, Sarah." Michael looked confused. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I took a deep breath. Sarah was looking for a rich husband. When she heard about the will from you, Michael, she saw an opportunity. She decided to pass off someone else's child as your own, to get her hands on your grandparents' estate. Jessica stepped forward, her voice steady. "The baby isn't Michael's. It's my son's child." The room fell silent. Then, I produced the DNA test results. Sarah's face drained of color as realization dawned. In a flurry of movement, Sarah grabbed her bag. "I don't need this. I don't need a beggar's child," she shouted as she fled the apartment. Michael stood there, shell-shocked, the baby still in his arms. He looked lost, pathetic even. Tom, recovering from the initial shock, asked in a small voice, "So, who gets this apartment?" I couldn't help but smile. "Well, Tom, let me enlighten you about the second part of my parents' will." I explained everything, the apartment, the car wash, all of it. Tom's face fell with each revelation. Suddenly, Tom was on his knees. "Lydia, please, I'm sorry. Forgive me. We can work this out." I looked at him coldly. "Get out, Tom. You have 2 days to leave my parents' house, or I'm calling the police." As Tom scrambled to his feet, he turned to Michael. "Son, give me the car I bought you. I need something." Michael's response was curt. "No. It's mine. You're not getting anything from me." With one last desperate look, Tom slunk out of the apartment. I then turned to Michael, who stood there, head bowed in shame. Jessica gently took the baby from his arms. "Michael," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Since it turns out I don't have any grandchildren, there are no other heirs to your grandparents' home besides me. I need you to move out as well." He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. I'll go pack my things." With that, he too left the apartment. As the door closed behind him, I let out a long breath. The apartment was quiet now, save for the soft coos of the baby in Jessica's arms. I looked at my old friend, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of liberation. "Well," I said, managing a small smile, "that didn't go quite how I expected when I woke up this morning." Jessica nodded, bouncing the baby gently. "You did what you had to do, Lydia. They left you no choice." As I sank onto the plush sofa, I realized that for the first time in years, I was truly free. Free from deception, free from manipulation, and free to live life on my own terms. The months following the confrontation flew by in a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. I found myself settling into my luxurious apartment, the space becoming a sanctuary of peace and new beginnings. One of my first decisions was to rent out my parents' house. It felt right, somehow, to have the property occupied by a young family who appreciated its warmth and history. The rental income provided a comfortable cushion, adding to the proceeds from selling Tom's car wash business. My friendship with Jessica blossomed. We'd meet for coffee, sharing stories, and supporting each other through the ups and downs of our new realities. And then there was little Tommy, Jessica's grandson, the child I had once believed to be my own. Despite the painful circumstances of his birth, I found myself developing a deep affection for the boy. "He has your eyes," Jessica would joke during our visits, and we'd laugh, finding humor in the absurdity of our intertwined lives. My relationship with Michael was a work in progress. The betrayal had cut deep, but he was still my son, and I couldn't bring myself to sever that bond completely. Our interactions were tentative at first, awkward phone calls, and stilted meetings in neutral coffee shops. But slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild. As for Tom, he became a ghost in my past. I heard through the grapevine that he'd fallen on hard times, his grandiose dreams of wealth and status crumbling in the wake of his exposed deceit. I saw him only once, by chance, as I was driving through town. He was working at a small kiosk, looking older and wearier than I remembered. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a flicker of something, not love or longing, but a kind of closure. Then the light changed, and I drove on, leaving that chapter of my life firmly in the rearview mirror.